Let's kick it over to Columbia, South Carolina. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on Shane Beamer here. I've got so many questions about him. Brandon Marcello is doing a series where he's talking to a lot of first-year head coaches, and those features have been prominently featured on 247sports.com. We put the Shane Beamer interview up on YouTube because there was such high demand for it, and it feels like full Tom Hanks mode over at South Carolina. You guys know if you watch the show, I'm all for using Tom Hanks metaphors whenever I can. I think we got a good one here. I'll get to it in just a second. But people are strangely already decided on Shane Beamer. What I mean by that is I have not read very many emails or DMs or any kind of correspondence I have with you guys where someone says, I don't know, it's wait and see for me on Shane Beamer. At like a 5-to-1 ratio for a guy who's never been a head coach, I either hear it's going to be a home run hire in time or it's going to be a disaster. Everyone's got their mind made up. I am in the vast minority here because I'm sitting here twiddling my thumbs saying, you know, I think, and it's a radical strategy, but I think I'll probably just wait for the guy to coach a game or 2 or 10 or 2 years, maybe even, before I decide on him. This is not a fairy tale world. So what I'm going to do here is I want to set the realistic foundation. The odds are long for any head coach at South Carolina, Shane Beamer especially. It's going to be extremely difficult there. They are going to be fighting upstream at every turn. They're going to be at a roster disadvantage relative to several teams on their annual schedule, including their in-state rival, which is an out-of-conference game. All that is in place. All that's a reality. This is not a fairy tale. This is not something where you say, hey, 10 games first year, watch and see. Not happening. What could happen, though? Because I think a lot of times, this time included, it's really easy to focus on what isn't there. What isn't there at South Carolina, in all likelihood, is the opportunity to just shock people in year one, to contend for the SEC East in year one. I don't know if Nick Saban could take over the program and do that. I mean, Saban took over Alabama and went 7-6 his first year. So I don't expect much different from Shane Beamer. In fact, 7-6 will probably be a good start. But let's just take a second, if you will, indulge me here. Instead of talking about what all isn't there, I do want to talk about some things that are there because I've spoken about this in the past. Carolina fans, for obvious reasons, they get on board with this. Some people who have gone to Carolina for games, they get on board. Most of you have not been to a game at Williams-Brice Stadium. Most of you have not spent a lot of time in Columbia, South Carolina. Because as much as everything I just said is reality on the negative side, you can change all those things. You know, the difficulty, the roster disadvantage, the perception, all that's in your control. So in a way, those are odds stacked against you, but the right coaching staff can turn those odds. But let me tell you what you do have at Carolina. What you do have at Carolina, I want you to think about this, is a head coach that views South Carolina football as a Tier 1 destination job. That is not a true Tier 1 destination job. We don't compare South Carolina with Ohio State. We don't compare them with Alabama. Shane Beamer does, though. It's very unique. Now, whether he ends up being the right guy for the job, obviously that's the chance that you take. Those are the dice you roll. But there are two programs right now that the rest of the country would not consider bona fide Tier 1 destination jobs that the current head coaches do deem that. And that's Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech, and that's Shane Beamer at South Carolina. What does that mean? Well, think about what it's like if they end up being the right guy. If you did catch the proverbial lightning in a bottle, you've got a guy who's never going to leave, and you got a guy who's willing not to go to the edge of the cliff, but over the cliff. And the entire program's following him for the brand that they represent, South Carolina, Georgia Tech. And so that is invaluable, very invaluable. Number two, and this is a very important thing to note, there is not a massive facilities gap they have to make up. The new head coach, when he was going to walk in the door, it ends up being Shane Beamer. It's not a situation where you look around and you say, man, Muschamp failed here. Obvious why. Look at this place. It's a dump. Carolina's really nice. Carolina's upgraded a lot of the things they need to upgrade. The infrastructure's there. In fact, that was part of the frustration with Will Muschamp. We gave you everything you said you needed to win, and then you didn't win. So we got to get a new guy in here. And once Shane Beamer walked in there, I don't know when the last time he had been back to Columbia was, but that place obviously had to have looked a lot different for the better to him than it looked last time he was there. They are doing a good, in fact, an excellent early job of selling Columbia, South Carolina to folks. And this is what you have to do. You got to sell experience. You don't have a product right now to sell. You don't have the trophy case to sell. A lot of the history that you and I may view as just a little while ago, 2010, 11, 12, it's not just a little while ago if you're 16 years old. You were a child when that stuff was happening. And you were barely old enough in some cases. If you're in high school right now, you're barely old enough to remember the Jadeveon Clowney years, the Lattimore years. Like you don't remember that nearly as fondly as we do. You got to sell Columbia. And they've done a really good job of it. If you haven't been to Columbia lately, don't tell me I went to a game there in 2002. I know what Columbia is like. No, you don't. It's a different town, totally different town. And they're doing a really good job of exclamating that point to recruits as much as they can. You got to get kids on campus. That's another part of lifting the dead period, and that's going to help them. The game day experience at South Carolina and the culture at South Carolina, the reason you got to get kids on campus is because if you're ever there, I've been there for big games. I've been there at field level, on the field, on the sideline when they've beaten Georgia. I've been on the sideline for that Alabama game a couple years ago. Phenomenal. If you closed your eyes and I told you, hey, what's this LSU game at Death Valley like? What's this Alabama game at Bryant-Denny like? You'd say, man, this sounds really loud in here. And then I'd say, open your eyes. This is Williams-Brice Stadium. Sandstorm, they don't play that at LSU. It's an incredible environment. A lot of people don't know about it because you haven't been able to get a lot of the elite recruits in the country in there. Recruits, short for recruits. Got to get them in there. And so they got a lot to sell. There is a lot there. You just got to be able to harness it and capitalize on it. What was the Tom Hanks reference that I was making? Well, I want you to go to Castaway. The planes crashed in the middle of the Pacific, and then you wash ashore, and what is the first thing that you're doing? Well, the first thing you're doing is you're trying to, SOS with your flashlight. But the second thing you're doing, once you realize it's going to be an extended stay here on this island, is we got to make fire. We got to have a way to cook. We got to have a way to stay warm. You remember watching Tom Hanks try to build that fire? And how he rubbed those sticks together and rubbed his hands raw and busted his blisters open, and it looked like it was never going to happen. That will be the South Carolina job for Shane Beamer in the immediacy and in the short to midterm future. Hopefully, and this is the big if, this is the big unknown, this is looking over the horizon, if they can finally get that spark. Tom Hanks got it. He finally got it. You remember how that went? It wasn't a little spark for long. It all of a sudden became, I have created fire. And you got fire. And then it's just there. And you build a big bonfire and all's well. Okay, at that point, it's kind of like Dabo and Clemson. They're tired of hearing this comparison to South Carolina for obvious reasons. But that's how it was for Dabo. He rubbed those sticks together for a long time. Yeah, they were winning in the ACC, but then they get wrecked by Florida State. Then they get wrecked in the Orange Bowl. And they thought they had arrived a couple of times before they really arrived. Will South Carolina arrive under Shane Beamer? I'm going to tell you this. He's got all the ingredients there, whether the rest of the country realizes it or not, to make it happen. Rub those sticks together and keep rubbing them and keep rubbing them and keep rubbing them. All you need is the spark. You'll get the fire after that.